let's hop in. As always, I've separated a couple of key heuristics for the spot, and these are the 4 key heuristics we will discuss today. My first point in this spot, and I think it's very important, is that you have to learn to be a good loser. Know when to fold them. For the people who know this poker song, know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Spot brings us to point number 2. Spot the green light, know when to hold them. So I think this is very important. Point 1 and point 2, they kind of go hand in hand. And you can, this is a philosophy that applies to poker in general. I think especially in this spot, I see people make a lot of mistakes. They don't over-apply pressure when they should, and they fight back way too much when they shouldn't. So calibrating your aggression accordingly is, I guess, what I'm trying to say. Playing pocket pairs on turns, and I wrote down facing barrel, because I think this is a trouble spot. In general, 3-bet pots out of position, pre-flop caller. A very big part of your range is these pocket pairs. And I think this is a trouble spot that many players have. So I will try to give you guys some heuristics on how to maneuver those. And last point, this is also something that I often see going wrong. Actually, someone actually owed me, I think it was my session I played this morning, going way too thin. But to be fair, I called him with ace king high and he showed up with pocket deuces. So he had like 5th pair or something. Stop value doubting yourself. What am I getting value from? This is something that you have to ask. There's a lot of lines in this spot where people go way too thin, like this guy that I just mentioned with pocket deuces. And I will explain you how to stop doing that. So point number 1, be a good loser. Know when to fold them. Starting pre-flop. This is actually a mistake that a lot of people make, is that they over call versus 3-bets when they're out of position, and especially versus bigger sizings. Okay, this is costing you a lot of money. I think if you play regular 6 max cash games or something, your full percentage here should be something around 55% minimum. I would say a little bit higher is even better, especially in the earlier positions. The 3-bet percentages of players behind you, if you see the actual number, especially if you filter out fish, people are usually on the tighter side, and people usually play like a 3-bet only strategy versus you. So they have a very linear range. Especially if they now also go a little bit bigger, it's actually a spot where you should at least fold, for example, 60 or maybe even more percent. I kind of already mentioned this, and I will show you this in a second. We play back less versus tighter. This is quite obvious, right? And linear 3-bet ranges as they contain way more equity. So if someone plays a split, meaning that they have a calling range and a 3-betting range, something that's a bit more common, for example, when you close the action behind you, if you're on the button, actually versus that range, we actually want to play back more than versus a range who plays basically 3-bet only, because then they usually pick their strongest hands. The last point, in a pre-flop sim, if a hand is a call or not, it's really dependent on how much equity we get to realize. And this really depends on villain's strategy. So how aggressive he is and the c-bet sizing that he uses. So if we spot players only c-betting 1/3 and are generally a bit more passive, versus those players, we can expand our ranges, and vice versa. If we have guys who play range c-bets in position, so they're very aggressive, right? We probably get to realize less equity. So therefore, we should actually be a bit tighter pre-flop. Last actually point that I wrote down is our range composition. Now, this is more of a theoretical consideration. Basically, if we look at the pre-flop range, which we will look at in a second, you can see that it's a little bit all over the place. It kind of mixes everything, right? And that's obviously because the solver knows the other pairs always. We get into many spots post-flop where our equity is quite fucked. So therefore, we cannot realize as much. So therefore, solver weights everything perfectly. In my opinion, in practice, it's more like if you think you can call pocket fives profitable, you should do it. It's not something to be too concerned about. But if we talk about point number 1, you usually don't want to overcall. So that's something to be wary about. So let's look at the first example, what I was mentioning. If we look at the pre-flop range, I took cutoff versus button. Start with this one then. Yeah. We open here from the cutoff, and here we have a button range. Right, so we can see that it's calling 12%, and it's 3-betting 12%, it's calling 5. A lot of players, they don't play calls, and especially like if we look at hijack versus cutoff, that actually makes a lot of sense. If you're on the button though, you usually do want to add cold calls in your range, but I mainly want to focus on what changes. So if we 3-bet and we look at our playback strategy, we're folding 53.7%, as you can see here. Whereas if we go to a range that's linear, meaning that he plays 3-bet only, in this example, so you can see here, he's 3-betting 14%. Here it was 3-betting 12%. And if we then look at our playback range, we are actually folding 60%. So, and why is that? Well, if we look at the 3-bet range, right, he's always 3-betting a hand like king, queen suited. Whereas in a split, it would sometimes call king, queen suited, and it's actually 3-betting king, 8 suited instead, which is a hand that if we play linear, we're not going to 3-bet. So it is actually something to be very wary about. Especially I took color versus bottom for a reason, because that's a place where people would split. So be very wary here in terms of how the range actually looks, and therefore you can adjust accordingly. Meaning that, for example, a hand like king, queen off, for example, becomes worth a little bit more money. King 9 suited becomes worth more money. Ace 9 suited. Like the bottom of your range, you can kind of expand, right? Because obviously if you have king 9 suited and you're up against king 8 suited sometimes, you have more equity, right? And if you're up against king, queen suited, less, because he sometimes flats that. So that's actually an important thing to take in consideration. Yeah, that's basically where I wanted to start off for pre-flop. All right. And then obviously with sizing, like I said, obviously the bigger people go and the smaller people go, the more we can get in there and the less we can get in there. I think that's pretty straightforward. Next is post-flop considerations. Recognize and respect the positions and boards that aren't yours. Okay, especially for the guys who like to fight. This is in general, right? We're playing a pre-flop caller spot, and I think somewhere earlier in the heuristic series, I kind of introduced the philosophy of pre-flop caller spots. You're simply trying to win more than folding, right? So we've already made the raise. Our goal is now to lose less with our calls than if we would just fold. The goal is not here to win a lot of pots, right? Your one was a flop is going to be naturally low. You're just going to try to realize just enough equity to make your call plus a fee, but it's not really the idea that you're going to win these pots more often. And if you don't kind of respect that, and you start to fight back in spots that aren't yours, it's usually, especially in this spot specifically, it costs people a lot of money. Post-flop, recognize and respect the position and boards that aren't yours. There's a very big difference between how we play in EP MP cutoff versus an in-position 3-bet compared to if we would play, for example, small blind versus button. Okay, so in these type of spots, usually these boards, we want to be a little bit tighter. Okay, also in these spots, usually when boards are ace or king high, and same for actually turns, or the board, or basically two broadways connect, it's usually the spots where we're forced to overfold. Okay, I will show you this in an example as well. If we look at an aggregated report and we compare, so in this case, we opened from the small blind, the big blind 3-bet we called. We checked from small blind towards the initial raise. The big blind c-bet at 1/3, and this is our fold percentage on average versus the c-bet. So we're folding 27% small blind versus big blind on average versus a flop c-bet. Whereas if we go to like a hijack versus cutoff spot, right, a tighter formation, and we do the same, so we check and in position c-bets, we're folding 37%. So that's what, 10% more, top of my head, right? Yeah, we're folding 10% more versus a c-bet. Right. Luckily, I think I've mentioned it in some of my other webinars as well. MDF, like minimum defense frequency, basically, okay, well, how big does he bet and how much you have to defend to make sure he cannot bet any two? You have to always take your equity disadvantage or advantage in consideration. Okay. That rule only applies when the equities are equally divided, when there's no person who has a significant range advantage. So in this case, we're kind of forced to overfold. For example, on ace board, as you can see, we're folding 68% to a 1/3 c-bet. That's obviously a massive overfold, but there's simply nothing we can do about it because of how the ranges are constructed. So this is kind of what I meant with some boards, they are just not yours. And actually in this specific spot, hijack versus cutoff versus button, EP versus MP, etc., this is going to happen a lot. Okay, and sometimes it can feel a bit gross that every time you're just folding, but that's kind of how this spot makes money. And if you don't do that, you're actually going to lose more than you're supposed to lose, which is also losing money, right? Sometimes losing the minimum is actually a very underrated skill in poker. But this is a spot where I think that is very, very, very important. Okay, so if we look at, for example, the highest overfold textures, let's look at something that's maybe a little bit less obvious. Actually, I recently reviewed someone. For example, I think an ace. Yeah, let's get this ace 7-3 board, for example. Or actually, I would have maybe liked to actually change one card. But hey, we can still do that. If we look at, for example, what we're supposed to do on ace 7-3 versus a c-bet, if we have pocket jacks, jack a spade, jack a club, we're straight away check folding the flop. Okay, this is actually also one of the spots, one of the rare spots in poker where on average human beings actually over defend, right? Well, if you have to fold jacks on the flop straight away, it's very easy to over defend now, is it? And actually in our previous webinar that we did, which was key heuristics for the opposite of the spot, right? I actually told you this leak of the population, and our exploit was going to be follow it up a lot with barrels, right? So usually an heuristic that you can use on like these type of boards, so you know that the pairs with a heart, that's usually the ones that you're going to pew, okay? So if you can see here, 8s, for example, with a heart would call, 9s with a heart would call, 10s with a heart would call, jacks with a heart would call. That's one heuristic. And you want to kind of look at backdoors. So for example, pocket 5s here. This is the hand that kind of mixes raises, sometimes calls. Pocket 5s can turn a lot of gutters. It basically has kind of the same Shona value as pocket 8s. So pocket 8s and pocket 5s are sort of the same hand. However, relatively speaking, 5s is better because it has more going on in the future. Okay, so that's actually another heuristic that's very important. So let's say, for example, let's say I make this a 5. So if we look at now the EV of calling pocket 8s, that is very, very small, guys, but just so you get the point. Pocket 8s now has 0.06 EV and pocket 9 0.04 EV, for example. And that's simply because now 8s turns more open-enders, right? So relatively speaking, 8s and 9s is kind of the same hand, right? But 8s is just a little bit better, if that makes sense. So this is something that you kind of have to look out for. Maybe actually a 6 would have been a better example, and I could show like pocket 7s versus pocket 9s or something. Yeah, pocket 7s here, for example, versus pocket 9s, that would have been a better example, right? So I hope you guys can see that. So that's something that you have to take into consideration. Your app, kind of your relative hand strength compared to your absolute hand strength. But something that then often goes wrong, I just gave you this heuristic, right? With one heart. I think that's usually a good heuristic to use. But then, for example, if we go to a board like, yeah, King Jack 3, I think is also a good example where I often see like mistakes being made. Then you use this heuristic, okay, I have a heart, and then you're suddenly going to call pocket 6s with a heart. No, it doesn't work like that. There's 2 Broadways on the board. Basically, you're screwed as soon as you see 2 Broadways. I don't care if you have a low pair with a heart. As you can see, it sometimes sprinkles something in here. But basically, just any underpair is just a fold. Okay? Because if we look at the imposition range, right? Especially if you would play 3-bet only, right? I mean, it just smacks it. The Broadways are his. And usually it's like the lower boards that are better for you, right? We mentioned like low pairs are a very big part of our range. So therefore, usually we want to fight back more on low boards and not on the high boards. All right. So I hope this makes sense. Let me see. Then actually one important, like we're talking now like hijack versus cutoff, like these tighter formations. As soon as we go to, where are we? Small versus big blind, for example, and we get maybe like a similar board. What was the other one? Like A7 something. So like a A7-3, I think we were looking at, right? Obviously, if you're blind versus blind, you're not gonna be check folding pocket 10s, right? So like I said, kind of play back, because obviously pocket 10s here makes a lot of money because we're playing blind versus blind, right? So that's a very important distinction when we talk about these 3-bet pots out of position. Usually, it's fine to play back a lot when you're blind versus blind. But it's more the losing that a good loser becomes more important when we're in this tighter formations like EPMP cutoff. And then actually we now kind of talked about flops mainly, but this concept actually also applies on the turn. Let me see. So if we look at this board, 10-7-4, hijack versus cutoff, Finland c-bets 40%. Now sometimes you will see half pot, sometimes you will see 1/3. Therefore I ended up with 40 just for this example. You can still c-bet quite a lot. It cannot c-bet range on a board like this, simply because it has all these offsuit broadways. This is actually a spot where we can actually attack people who simplify their c-bet strategy and just kind of play range type of c-bets. Actually something important to spot. Actually, I have this point written down. But this would, for example, be one of these boards that I think we could attack more than what GTO suggested, because I think people c-bet more than what GTO suggests. But let's say, for example, we did go for the check call, and the turn is a king. So, right, we talked about if Broadways connect, or if the flop or turn is the ace or the king, just very good for the impositions range. Then if the hijack checks, as you can see, it's allowed to c-bet turn 80%. And basically it checks when it has jacks, queens, or nines. So yeah, basically it's allowed to bluff everything. And there's simply not much we can do about it. If again, you're going to be like, oh yeah, but he's going after me. Yeah, well, he's going after you with ace jack and you have pocket eights, right? And that's kind of best case scenario. So again, these are just spots where you kind of have to let it go. As in position though, by the way, is also important to add, like you can see it goes for this 40%. It tries to kind of find this sizing that puts eights in a tough spot, right? Like pocket eights. If you would just bet all 3/4 here, you don't put your opponent in a tough spot with pocket eights. So therefore, it kind of rolls out like a 40%-ish sizing just to put a lot of pressure on these low pairs, which, like I said, is a very big part of your range. So yeah, there's nothing you can do about it. Even if villain would range c-bet this turn, that means he would also c-bet more nines, jacks, and queens, more king, jack, etc. Pocket tens always. We simply have to overfold, right? And that story really changes compared to, for example, if we make this a deuce. Now that's obviously a different story. Now it's only allowed to bet 60% of the time. Now it's straight away up this sizing, right? It's interesting. I think probably what you will maybe see most is maybe like a 3/4-ish. Basically, again, it's trying to pick a sizing to put a lot of pressure on these pairs. Because basically, again, in the other spot, we were also sometimes calling nines, sometimes calling eights. They were basically indifferent, right, for 40%. And now they're indifferent for 75%. So in terms of if you're in position and you want to pick your bet sizing, it can be around that. But on this board, on the turn, like in the other spot, it was already c-betting 80%. And even if it would c-bet a range, on the turn, we still couldn't do anything about it. This board, though, however, if we look at kind of his bluff allowance, right, meaning that how much of his air is he allowed to bet? He's allowed to bet his air around half of the time, right? So this is actually a spot where it could potentially be overshooting. So therefore, it's easier for villain to overdo it, and therefore it's better to play back on, for example, a deuce turn than it is on a king turn, because even if he overdoes it, there is no overdoing it in a spot where you're allowed to do everything, all right? So know when to fold them. I hope this is clear. And this is one of the biggest leaks. That's why I started with this point. This is the biggest leak I see in this spot. People not respecting the equity disadvantage that they have and adjusting accordingly. Okay. And also they kind of in general play small blind versus big blind the same as MP versus cutoff. Whereas you should be way more sticky and aggressive when you're small blind versus big blind because the ranges are way wider. And you should respect the equity disadvantage way more when you're, for example, MP versus cutoff. Okay. So usually people are not aggressive enough small versus big blind, don't play back enough, and they play back too much, MP cutoff. Okay, so they kind of miss the best of both worlds. What if you know they range c-bet on ace-high boards? Well, that depends which ace-high board, and actually we will get to that in a second, right? Because let's say it's ace-king X. Yeah, okay, he's allowed to c-bet range, right? So there's still nothing we can do about it. But there are indeed some boards that are also ace-high that is not allowed to c-bet range. So actually we will get to that in a second as well. If they over c-bet the ace-high boards that aren't supposed to over c-bet, so think ace-6, 5, two-tone or something, we're going to indeed check raise a very big part of our range. By the way, as well for value as bluffs, this can maybe be counterintuitive. Maybe I don't know actually if I really planned on talking about that too in depth, but we can definitely kind of go into that. So we kind of now know when to fold them. Like I said, very important, guys. Now let's move on to when to hold them, aka spot when you have the green light to play back. So when is playing back actually gonna earn you money instead of lose your money? Pre-flop, look for good promotions and act on discounts. Overcalling versus smaller 3-bet. So when people 3-bet a suboptimal sizing, so they go smaller than they should, the main hands that now benefit are like all your pocket pairs and all like kind of your suited stuff. You can see a flop cheaper. Make sure to always, when you see a good discount, to always go for it. But be careful with hands like ace-jack off, king, queen off. This is actually a question that I had recently as well. Like, okay, what do you do versus like this 36 type of fish that, you know, you open the button to 2.5 and they 3-bet you to 8 with like a 4% range. So they're super tight, but you know, they gave you this discount. It's mainly this. It's like the pocket pairs and suited stuff that always want to take that discount, but you still want to be careful with the hands like king jack offsuit if you're against, for example, a 4% 3-bet range, obviously. Defend more when the 3-bet ranges become wider and or polarized. That is something that I actually already showed you. Cutoff versus button, does he play 3-bet only? Okay, we have to be tighter, right? Because we're up against king queen suited, ace jack suited all the time instead of king 8 suited or king 7 suited. And the best example would be small blind versus big blind, right? Where you could 3-bet 10-8 offsuit or king-7 offsuit. So this is obviously the spot where, again, we play back the most because the range is the weakest. And I'm saying this now in this spot, because in this spot, like I said, I see a lot of people make mistakes, but this is, if you zoom out, if we talk about heuristics that apply to every spot we talked about, this is a heuristic that applies to every spot. Get in there versus face-up/passive players but don't overestimate post-up edge versus fish. So let's start with this first point. Like I said, hands in solvers and in preflop charts are calls because they realize a certain amount of equity. Obviously, if your opponent is more passive or straightforward, meaning that if he checks, he never has it, and therefore he's going to massively overfold, for example, or in general, he's just not going to be very aggressive, we get to overrealize equity. So versus these guys, make sure to always defend, for example, all your mixes pre-flop. And vice versa, obviously, if someone is over-aggressive. Don't overestimate post-up edge versus fish. Like I said, fish usually 3-bet quite a tight range when they're in position, maybe on average 6-7%. They usually don't use 1/3 c-bet sizings. They usually bet half pot or 3/4 spot. So we're up against a tighter range. This is a spot where they usually are quite aggressive. So don't, put your entitlement aside here for a second. Be like, oh yeah, I'm going to outplay the fish when I'm out of position. And then you always call pocket fives, for example, even though the 3-bet was quite big. But you say, well, I'm a pro, he's a fish, and then the flop comes king 3-4. You're like, okay, nice. I can realize he's going to see bet 1/3. And then he bets 3/4. And you're like, oh, fuck. Okay, I guess I fold. But this is going to happen quite often. All right. Post lock. So like I said, play back when you are playing small blind versus big blind in general. You don't play back, right? You fold them when you're MP versus cutoff, but you hold them when you're small blind versus big blind. EP cutoff when the board or turn is lower than queen high and broadways don't connect, right? It's that ace high, it's this king highs, or when two broadways connect. That's when you have to be careful and simply overfold. But when that's not the case, that's actually when you want to play back usually even a bit more, because people usually simplify to, for example, a range c-bet, like I said, on the 10-7-4 board. That's actually when we can apply a lot of pressure, or the board that Danny also said, a6-5 two-tone, for example. Boards that are over c-bet, that's exactly what Danny mentioned. And I added and/or overfolded versus check raise, or under 3-bet versus check raise. And I can tell you that usually, if you look at, okay, which boards are over c-bet, they usually also overfolded to check raise, price. And they usually also under 3-bet, especially if we make the adjustments, if we note lock ourselves to go for quite a wide range. So let me give you guys some examples of when to hold them. So we already kind of talked about that 10-7-4. Let's look at the aggregated reports. So obviously small blind versus big blind, as we already had concluded. But basically what we can do is, okay, we're going to look at these aggregated reports and then be like, okay, well, which board? Now we're going to look at it from the opposite direction. So how often are they allowed to c-bet? So we have the small blind versus big blind here, and we have the hijack versus cutoff here. So hijack versus cutoff, like I said, they're allowed to c-bet a lot. But if we want to find, and this, by the way, guys, this goes for all spots in poker. This is kind of how you do it. If you want to find back boards, if you want to find boards that they're likely over attacking, you start with, okay, well, which boards shouldn't they be betting, right? Which boards have a high checking frequency where they probably are not checking a lot? Now, obviously, like 5, 6, 7, I think most players nowadays know that, you should probably not c-bet this board very often. So in the past, like 5 years ago, this was a great board to check raise sort of range on, because people were like, okay, well, I'm the initial raiser, so I'll c-bet. Nowadays, I'm pretty sure that's not really the case. Doesn't mean that we cannot still use this exploit, but we have to kind of go up the ladder. So what would be a board that people can kind of mistake as a good board for them, but it actually isn't? Actually, I see this ace fix 5 here straight away. So an ace high board that gets checked 72% of the time. And this is kind of what Danny indeed also said. So if we actually go to this board. So this could definitely be a board, if we want to, for example, find some, you could call it tricks. Like the way I kind of see poker is you have like a couple of layers that make up for your poker game, right? You have kind of your baseline strategy, which is kind of the foundation. And then on top of that, you have certain tricks in your arsenal. This could be a trick, right? You find the over c-bet board and you start to massively check raise there, for example. And then the last layer in the pyramid I see as like in-game adaptability. So how good are you on your toes in the middle of the action, spotting like smaller nuances or cooler plays, etc. So this could be like one of the tricks you could add to your arsenal. Whereas, for example, with aggregated reports and trying to optimize your frequencies, that's more like, okay, I'm trying to construct a solid baseline strategy. So this could definitely be a board. Let's go to the AI A65 and kind of talk about, actually, we can see actually that we sometimes dunk. I actually like this versus guys who are better. But dunking we do because we don't expect someone to bet. But if we expect people to oversee bet, which I can confirm that that's the case on this board, all our dunks become checks because he's going to put money in the pot for us. So let's say he just c-bets 1/3, which I think is going to be very common. We can actually straight away see that we're going to do already quite some check raising here because we have like this 6s and 5s, 6-5 suited, and also in the future, right? Not only now, but since we're playing deep stacked, no limit hold'em, the fact that 7s is going to connect or 4s is going to connect in future runouts as well. We are quite suited heavy. He's more offsuit heavy. So, right, we have a lot of flush draws. So this is just not a great board for him to start investing a lot of money. When people do start to invest a lot of money, usually how you can punish this is indeed by check raising. So if we would node lock this to something that's, I think, more appropriate. So let's say, for example, the checking frequency is, let's say the c-bet frequency is something like 70%. Seems reasonable for like, especially if you play like 100, 200 NL or something along those lines. We can now see that we are check raising 30%. Now, a very important note here is that you also want to check raise your value. And this is sometimes counterintuitive because people sometimes think, well, if I want to bluff a lot in a spot, I don't want to add value. But that's not really the case in this spot, and I'll explain you guys why. Because he upped the c-bet frequency, but he also upped the c-bet frequency with hands that a hand like ace-queen can now get value from. So the more money he puts in the pot with a hand like pocket 9s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, pocket queens, pocket kings, the higher our check raising frequency with a hand like ace-queen becomes because there are simply more hands to get value from. Also, I would say a hand like ace-queen or ace-king, usually on this ace-high board, people are under aggressive on turns. That's because like the turn barreling range is not very intuitive. People like to barrel equity, and there's not a lot of equity on ace-high boards. So usually you're also not really inducing a lot. So I'm personally a bigger fan of check raising quite on this type of board. So I would probably also check raise, for example, a hand like ace-jack or ace-10 basically all the time. And add a bunch of these hands, like your under pairs, which we will actually get to in a second as well. So pocket 4s here will be a prime candidate. You're unblocking all the broadways, you're unblocking all the jacks, 10s, etc. You can turn quite some equity, right? On a deuce, on a 3, on a 7, on an 8. And like I said, it's already a board that's pretty good for you. So, and by the way, also what I said earlier in terms of overfolding the check raise, I think here there's definitely some, let me see if it's intuitive to overfold. No, I don't think so necessarily. It's basically calling all these pairs with a heart, it's calling it flush draws. There's no hand. Maybe pocket kings, no heart. It's maybe a bit intuitive. Same with pocket queens, no heart. Actually, it's sometimes already folding ace jack. So I don't necessarily think this is an overfolded spot on the flop. But it's very important then that if you go for the check raise, to follow it up. So obviously, especially if the turn is an 8, for example, you have pocket 4s. It's a pretty intuitive barrel, I would say. Because remember, as soon as he's over c-bet at the flop, he's put too much money in the pot with these type of hands. He's now basically fucked. So make sure that if you try to exploit this one, to also apply pressure on the later street. Okay? This is actually very, very important. Not necessarily something that I plan to talk about, but this is very important because often actually the check raise on the flop, if we look at the defending range, is probably not going to get through more often than theory. But the barrels would definitely get through. All right? So actually important point to add. I hope this kind of explained your point, Danny. What if you know they range c-bet on ace-high boards? I think we kind of nailed that in terms of answering. Actually, another board that we can look at is this 10-7-4, right? We already talked about that turn deuce, but again, like 65%, let's say some in terms of rate sizing, right? In the other board, we were check raising like a bit over 3x. On a board like this, usually on 10-7-4, we actually want to check raise quite small. So it's c-betting like 6 big blinds and it's check raising. So it's almost a check min raise on this low board. This is going to be especially efficient if people start over c-betting. And why do we check raise this sizing? Well, we're trying to make like these overcards indifferent. So usually this part of the range, as you can see, ace king, ace queen, king queen. That's kind of the part that we're trying to target. deny equity from those hands, and then, for example, we can suddenly check raise a hand like pocket eights, right? Get some protection. In terms of also flop 3-betting, like I said, usually people don't 3-bet enough check raises when they're in position. They usually kind of default to calling. If we reduce this flop 3-bet, we're going to check raise more, because then we can get denier from the king queen without it costing our equity realization. So this is actually a great example of a board where if we would node lock to something that's a bit more realistic what's going on, people kind of go for range c-bet. Let's already see how that changes the strategy. Like I said, I think this is very common. Still go for that. We are obviously going to increase our frequency, right? Because now he has even more of these hands that, you know, he put money in the pot with. If we would now also say, okay, versus a check raise, you are basically always folding, for example, ace king, ace queen, king jack. I think it's actually pretty realistic. Actually, if we look at suits, probably like some ace jack and stuff, I think they're now, for example, it's peeling ace jack of clubs. Don't think it's that realistic. And then if we reduce the 3-bet a little bit, which I definitely think is realistic. Also, like I said, I know that in data, that's probably the case. Then kind of this is what happens. And this actually, I think, is a pretty solid strategy if you play at lower stakes, to play a very, very, very aggressive check raise strategy on both these type of boards. Now, obviously, like I said, on 6-5-4, that would be the best example. But the problem is people don't make the c-bet. So that's actually a spot where donking is actually a very solid strategy. But these type of boards, I think, are the best boards to attack together with the a6-5, as we explained earlier. And again, you also want to go quite thin-ish for value. Obviously, unless you think your opponent is just... It kind of depends. So, for example, we're now making him fold a hand like king-queen. But let's say, for example, you're against a complete maniac who would always triple off king-queen, and you know that, and you have pocket eights. Yeah, obviously, you don't really want him to fold king-queen. So if you're sitting here with pocket eights on the flop and you're super happy because you know you're going to call down, you're already like, oh yeah, here it comes. Then obviously we don't have to play check raise with pocket eights. Okay. So we're denying king queen because obviously in theory, king queen is going to play perfect. But if king queen makes a mistake by always over bluffing, why deny the equity of king queen? All right. So this is kind of the last layer that I just talked about, right? The in-game adaptability. So we have kind of our baseline strategy. Now we added the trick. And then if we can in-game spot that third layer of, hey, this guy is completely out of line. I'm going to no longer focus on denying with my pocket eights, but I'm going to focus on inducing by simply calling and letting him blast off. So know when to hold him, know when to fold him. In my opinion, the most important thing to understand in poker in general, but specifically in this spot. Is this clear for you guys? If we check with for value on the flop, what advice do you have playing turns and rivers after? Okay, we can quickly dive into that. I see some questions. So I think I already answered this for the a6-5, correct? So basically, as soon as villain has put too much money in the pot on a board that's not his, with too thin of a range, so too much nines. So if he put too much money in the pot with this portion of its range on a board that's not his, he's basically fucked, right? There's no way back. So the more we would put this in his betting range, the more we're just going to check raise and empty the clip. Which, like I said, in practice, I think is a good strategy. So my advice on these type of boards, you're going to go check raise, bet turn, jam river very often and very thin as well. Like I said, a hand like ace jack, I think is perfectly fine to go check raise, bet turn, jam river. Now the jam river kind of depends. Obviously, if you're up against a complete nit, you can just check fold the river. That's also completely fine with a hand specifically like ace jack, or maybe go for a smaller sizing depending on the SPR. But especially I think from a bluff perspective, you usually just want to go for it, because the more of these hands that go in the C, actually for the people who've seen, actually I made a video with Joe Ingram on GTO Wizard YouTube channel where I kind of explained this concept. And this is how you also explain range c-bet type of people. You're going to go check raise, bet turn and bet river. And he's going to, the more of nines through kings he adds to a c-bet range, the less he's allowed to fold on later street to not overfold. Okay? So therefore, it's easier for him to overfold on later streets. And that's kind of what's going to happen on this board. So I think this board's quite clear. Small disclaimer, we cannot, GTO Wizard and myself, we cannot get hold responsible for any bluffs put up that did not go well. All right? But hey, if people then snap you off on a river with ace queen, it's perfectly fine, right? It's usually like this pocket press, like it's already going for big sizing. I would personally, I don't know how stacks are exactly. I think I usually end up betting like half pot-ish or something on turn. And then basically what usually happens is that you keep a bit more ace. I mean, this 8 turn is very good. If you make it like a deuce turn, for example, I think there it applies a little bit more. So here you kind of get these pairs that are still in there. It's not really allowed to fold an ace yet. So I think these type of boards are just very good for like check raise, half pot-ish, I usually bet, and then jam the river. And then especially, by the way, when you go small versus big blind, and you have ace jack, for example, that's a great spot to go very wide, because big blind versus small blind does have like ace 4 offsuit, for example, right? Going back to the 10-7-4, kind of the rule that I use, if now, let's say the turn is a Broadway, so we check raised a lot in like the middle region, right? So if the middle region improves, so let's say the turn is a 5, a 6, an 8, a 9, a 3, I usually just follow it up with block. That's kind of my strategy. I don't know. Let's see what solver does. Or like block, half pot. I think block here is fine. Okay, so it actually polarizes more. That's obviously because we have kind of node locked. After node locking, usually this is what happens. It basically checks range. Also fine strategy if you want to really go easy. I usually check more range when high card turns come. So you check raise flop a lot, then you check range on high card turns. I block a lot when the middle region completes. So 5, 6, 8, 9. And on a deuce and a 3, so complete blank. Or actually on a 4 and a 7 and a 10, I would also check a lot. And on a complete blank, that's when I kind of wing it. Sorry, I don't have a better advisor exactly on a 3 or deuce turn. Luckily, that's one of the fewer turns. Yeah, you're just gonna do a little bit of everything. I cannot give you guys advice on literally every run out in the deck, but that's roughly how I would approach the situation. All right, and like I said, I would not approach it with a 3/4 sizing. I would approach it with a block sizing. That allows us to bet more hands like pocket eights, for example, here on the turn. I know if solver agrees after node locking. Okay, it sometimes agrees. But that's obviously, like I said, it has already node locked. And basically anything that happens after a node lock is usually this. All right, I hope I sort of gave you guys some guidelines. Let's continue on the next point. But these are the most important points, and we kind of already discussed most of it. So playing pocket pairs on the turn. Very important to start off with is that actually we specifically on, like, I'm talking now specifically versus turn barrels. So these are spots that people have a lot of trouble with. So you check off flop with a pocket pair. Let's say there was this 10-7-4, right? You check out pocket eights instead of check raise, which now people are going to go for a check raise. Let's say you did check call, turn is a deuce, check, fill in barrels, you're sitting there with pocket eights, right? I'm sure everyone watching has been in this situation. You call all pocket pair out of position, you check all the flop, and on the turn, like, and you have all these pocket pairs, and you should sometimes defend some of them, etc. However, a lot of those spots are S-played scenarios, which actually is a big part of my coaching philosophy. A lot of poker discussions are around the spot that are S-played scenarios. So a mistake has been made earlier in the tree, and we're now in a situation that's really screwed, but could have kind of been prevented, or at least we should have seen that this was going to happen quite often if we would look ahead. So, for example, how can we prevent getting in that situation quite often? That's by 4-bet bluffing pre-flop with 7s to 10s. Let's say, for example, your MP versus a cut of 3-bet, and he's going linear. Let's say if pocket eights. Pocket eights is usually kind of the hand that I like, or pocket nines, especially if you're a bit tighter. These are actually great 4-bet bluffs. Kind of what you can do, especially versus 3-bet only guys. If he folds a hand like ace-queen offsuit or king-10 suited, that's obviously great if you have pocket nines, right? And usually they call you with a hand like ace-5 suited or 5-6 suited or 6-7 suited or pocket eights. So actually pocket nines and pocket eights, depending on the position, or even pocket tens if you play full ring and you play EP, MP or something like that. These actually make for great 4-bet bluffs. So it's a little trick to add to your 4-bet bluffing strategy. So if you do that, and you're not calling all your pocket pair pre-flop, you already get in this situation less often. The next one is obviously we're going to have to check fold the flop. Know when to fold them. So on these ace high boards, king high board, probably you're not going to check call, so you don't get into the turn spot. So you're going to 4-bet, don't get into the turn spot. You're going to check raise flop. So ace 6-5 two-tone, we have pocket fours, we have pocket sevens, pocket eights with backdoors. Go for the check raise, so we don't get in the check call, face the barrel line. Next little trick is we're going to lead the turn. So let's say, for example, we did call the 10-7-4, and the turn is, for example, a 5 or a 6. We can also lead the turn. So again, we don't get into that situation. So there's many things we can actually do before getting in the situation that people have trouble with to not get in the situation that people have trouble with. In general, if you get into a situation that's very difficult in poker, you have to always kind of reflect, okay, am I getting in this situation too often? Because then you might send your hand to a player that you think is good, or to a coach, and you want advice how to play the spot. And now we say, yeah, okay, this spot is pretty shitty. I also find this spot pretty shitty. The solution is try to not get in that spot as often enough by looking ahead and recognizing that a lot of shitty things are going to happen in the future. And usually you don't want to invest a lot of money in pots where shitty things can happen in the future. And you want to invest money in the pot where good things can happen in the future. So lead turn, I will give you that in a second. If you've done all this, obviously you can still get in that spot sometimes. And then we have to estimate villain's bluff allowance, aka how easy and likely is it for him to overbluff. We have to look at the unblockers of our hand. So how does this add to the amount of bluffs that he has, or does it reduce? And how clean RR improves. I will first dive into a leading spot, and then I will actually go over this example that I haven't done before, but actually will review a hand that I played, and I will kind of explain to you guys my thought process, and we also will consult the solver to see if the wacko is just, saying stuff, or if it's also actually solver approved. All right. So the first one that I wanted to go into was the turn lead. I think it was this one. So let's say we did not go for this almost range check raise strategy on the flop, and we did call, for example, pocket eights. Simply the fact that we have already folded, for example, a hand like ace queen off, we have folded queen jack suited, we have folded king jack suited most of the time. The fact that we have already folded these hands, even though the 6, it did also slightly improve us. But as soon as usually broadways miss, just the fact that we called and already folded our air, low card turns can give us some sort of advantage. And how do we turn that advantage into money? It's usually by leading small. So, for example, we check call 10-7-4, turn is a 6. You can actually see solver leads 25% with quite a wide range. Let's say on a turn 8, if he still does it. 6 is kind of the dream card. On an 8, he does it as well. Does it do it on a 9? I don't think on a 9 anymore, because then king jack, for example, his king jack has improved. So that's where kind of the cards that we're missing, right? Okay, it does lead, but lead spot. Who finds that gets bonus points. Send me the hand history. It probably doesn't do it maybe on a 5. And there I would say, hey man, go ahead and do it on the 5. They don't know you cannot do it on the 5. And for me, a 5 and a 6 is basically the same. No one can see this much nuance that they will say, hey, you're leading on a 5. You're not allowed to do that. Oh, but you're leading on a 6. Okay, now I fold. So this is another way that we can not get into that turn spot as often. Now for the hand, I think if I just now min raise, we can see the hand. Now, this was actually a hand that I played in the Cash Game World Championship, mid-stakes edition, 10K and L against the M-Boss is a bit too much for me, but this was a nice competition. I'm not showing you my hand, and that's on purpose, because I want you kind of to think about, okay, so what are we going to do with our pocket pairs? So we call the 3-bet here out of position. Now, in this championship, there was no rake, and therefore you're allowed to call way more pocket pairs. A bluff here, that would be great. Pocket eights. We kind of talked about that. I think it's a kind of a sexy 4-bet bluff. So definitely try to add that into your game. So I called. Flop is jack 2-5, and he c-bets this 40%. Again, kind of like a sweet spot sizing. He doesn't want me to just be able to call 2 over cards. For example, let's say I have ace 10 of diamonds here. This sizing kind of sucks. Even ace queen of diamonds kind of sucks. A hand like pocket 7s, no heart kind of sucks. So I think this sizing is pretty good in terms of if you think about how difficult they make it with my range. Now the board is jack high, right? So it's not 2 broadways. It's not ace high. It's not king high. So usually he's maybe not allowed to c-bet everything. And usually you can play back on these boards at a good frequency, right? So let's say, for example, I had to hand like 5-4 here. We don't have that much sets on deuce 5 jack. For example, let's say it's 5-4 jack. We definitely want to check raise, for example, more with a hand like pocket 6s than now on deuce 5 jack. So pocket 6s with a heart, I think is an okay check raise. 5-4 suited, I think is okay check raise. 4s with a heart's okay check raise, but you probably don't want to overdo it on this board. I think top of my head that most pairs we can just call. So 6s to 10s probably just always calling. 4s, 3s probably only with a heart. That's kind of roughly the guidelines for the pocket pairs that I can give you. Now the turn we face a barrel, and this is a very common spot, right? You have all these pocket pairs. Now what? The first question we should always ask ourselves is, what is Winnen's bluff allowance? So how much of his air is he allowed to barrel, right? So what do you guys think? How much, let's say he has air, is he allowed to always barrel king, queen? Is he allowed to always barrel 7-8, queen 10, ace king, ace queen? Is it easier for him to overdo it or underdo it? That's kind of the first thing that you always want to ask yourself, right? And then if you think, well, it seems like it's pretty GTO, that's when we want to kind of defend GTO. But first, always we want to estimate, okay, can we overfold or can we underfold, basically, right? In a kind of play the GTO strategy, we first have to recognize that the spot is indeed close. It is indeed more of a GTO. So actually, let's quickly look at the solution so far. So this is kind of his range if you give it no rake, etc. So his range can call, his range can 3-bet. It's a bit all over the place. Usually if you don't know someone's range, do this. Give it a little bit of everything, especially in 3 and 4-bet pots where post-flop outputs can be very sensitive to having one combo or not having one combo. So it's very important to give it a little bit of everything. So villain c-bets 40%. Basically, it's allowed to c-bet everything. Now, we can indeed see that 4s with a heart and 3s with a heart are indeed calling or raising. So that was correct. 6 is actually sometimes folding. I would probably not have done that. Same with pocket 7s. Okay. Turn. This is where the hand gets most interesting. So if we look at no made hand, king high, ace high. So it's allowed to barrel his air half of the time. Okay. Half of the time. So unlike other spots, right, that we concluded, let's say the turn is a king, it's very hard for him to overbluff on a king because all his bluffs improved, right? He's allowed to bluff everything. So if we look at gut shots, open and straight draws, flush draws. So draws, right? Combo draws, flush draws. It's only allowed to bluff his draws half of the time. So let's say you're here with king, queen, you should sometimes check. 10-8 should actually full frequency check. 7-8 should actually full frequency check, which actually makes a lot of sense. 7s and 8s. Blocking 7s and 8s. So actually, I think at first glance, easier to overdo it than underdo it. Always important to take consideration. So it barrels, and we can indeed see we have indifferent live here with our 6s, 7s, pocket 8s, and pocket 10s. So how do we now kind of determine if we should call them? Like I said, the first consideration, I think it's easier for him to overshoot. So I will always lead more towards calling than folding. Taking pocket 6s is simply the worst of all the pocket pairs. 7s or 8s, I think it's quite close. I would probably prefer to have 7s, right? If we talk about unblocking, I think 8s, he can have 10-8 suited. Now, obviously, in solver, he was never barreling 8-10 suited, or had like queen 8 suited. So then, obviously, for us, 8s is a call. I think it's way more likely that he's just barreling 8-10 and queen 8. Also, if we think about pocket 8, let's say we call rivers in 8 and he has queen 10, that would really suck. So actually, I think 7s here, 7s and 8s kind of the same hand, but 7s has better unblockers. That's cleaner improvability. So I would say 7s here is definitely better than pocket 8s. Pocket 10s blocks a lot of bluffs. So king 10, queen 10, 10-8 has kind of the same properties that I said earlier. So if we call pocket 10s rivers 10, he has all king queen. That would really suck for us. He has 7-8, could have 7-8. That would really suck for us. So I would say here, I would probably always call 10s because I think it's a spot where it's easy for a villain to overdo it. I would probably fold 8s and 6s, and I would always call 7s. So that's kind of like considerations that you have to take in order to figure out in game, okay, am I supposed to call my hand? Spoiler alert, to go back to the hand, I indeed have pocket 7s with a heart. I indeed decide to make the call. River is the ace, and villain jams the river, and we have a fourth pair. That is obviously not good. Let's go back to the solver. We called pocket 7s, so far GTO. Check. How do we decide, again, if we're interested in bluff catching? Well, that depends, right? We first want to look at, does it have a lot of bluffs? So if we look at the no-made hand range, I guess king high is also no-made hands. No-made hand, king high, low pair, I guess would now be bluff. Yeah. So he's actually allowed second pair bluff. No, second pair obviously is jack queen. So actually, he's allowed in GTO to bluff basically always. Right? He's allowed to bluff 87% of his air. So if we think about bluff catching, this goes for both flop, for turn, river. If we're interested because someone is overdoing it, we first have to see if it's easy to overdo it. Well, if you're already allowed to bluff all your air, it's very hard to overdo it. So there's a low upside. What is the thinnest hand that he could jam actually here for value? Is he jamming queens? No. Kings? No. But this is based on the range. And actually, we already concluded that on the turn, we actually think that king, queen, or 10-8, or queen 8 is way more likely to just barrel. So actually, I think he actually, sure, with the air in GTO that he rides the river with, he can bluff it mainly. But if we give him more air on the turn, he's not allowed to bet it again on the river. In theory, actually, if we think about, again, a hand like pocket 10s probably kind of sucks. Actually, pocket 10 sometimes calls. That's pretty interesting. I would say it blocks a lot of the bluffs. Queen 10, king 10. What am I missing? It's not jamming ace 10. Why is 10 so great? No clue why 10s is so great. Pocket 7s, as you can see, would sometimes sprinkle on the cards, good off blockers, unblockers, so we kind of have to see, yeah, do we think it's likely that he overdoes it? I, in game, went for the call with pocket sevens. And he showed ace queen. So now people thought, okay, Rekka's going to show a really cool hero call. I lost. So I actually still think it's a good hero call because of the turn considerations. Actually, he had a hand, ace, if you look at actually ace queen. Ace, a heart, queen. It's actually shouldn't actually always jam. So that's always a problem. If people show up with a quote tin bet in a spot where you hero call, that could actually be trouble. A good hero fold. No. All right. So basically what I did is on the turn, I made him barrel most of his draws. And then what we could actually see is that pocket sevens is now actually always calling. Actually, any pair is calling. That's why I said in your order of importance, first think, okay, is he likely to overshoot it? Because we can then go to all these nuances. But if he's just overshooting it, we can just call all our pairs, right? That's always the most important thing. And then if we think it's close, we have to dig deep in, like I said, blockers, improvability, all that stuff. Then with that turn range, if he gets to the river, remember in GTO, he was allowed to bet 90% of his air. Now he's only allowed to bet 64% of his air. Well, in my opinion, on an ace, people are not going to give up. If he's arriving here on the river with 10-8, he's not like, yeah, okay, I'm not going to bluff, right? So therefore, I decided to make the hero call. Obviously, like in GTO, it's a little bit of everything. Yeah, you guys tell me if you think it's a good call, yes or no. Probably actually we're gonna kind of leave it here. This last point that I added, like the 4 heuristic, is also less important. So I think the most important things we have discussed. Let me quickly go to the recap. So remember, guys, most important here, know when to fold them. Don't invest more than necessary in spots that aren't yours. Second, know when to hold them. Spot the situations where your equity remains high or is upgraded and play back accordingly. So, for example, this A6-5 that we saw, this 10-7-4 that we saw, small blind versus big blind in general compared to MP versus cutoff. Point number 3, pocket pairs on turn is not as played scenarios, right? Because I said, okay, this turn spot that I just showed you is very annoying. But a lot of them can actually be prevented if you would have 4-bet bluff pre-flop, if you would have check raised the flop, if you would have check folded the flop more often, if you would have down bet the turn. But then if you get into the scenario, yeah, it is a little bit dicey. But I hope I gave you guys some guidelines. All right. Thank you, guys. If you got any questions, ask in Discord, leave a comment. I hope also the practical, actually, I never really give practical examples, but this hand kind of popped up in my memory when I was talking about this spot. So I hope you guys like that. Thank you guys and see you next time.